In this class, we are going to learn about Khayal as a genre of Indian classical music. In the previous classes, we've already touched upon various aspects of Khayal very briefly, but in this class, we're going to try and understand Khayal in depth. Now, Khayal is a preeminent music genre included in the broader category of Hindustani or North Indian classical music. Historically associated with royal courts and aristocratic patronage, over the past 2 centuries, it has emerged as a well-recognized concert form performed across the length and breadth of the Indian subcontinent, as well as on the international stage. Parallelly, the genre, which was previously the domain of hereditary musician communities, has gradually been established now as a field of study and profession open to aspirants from all social backgrounds and varied levels of training. These shifts in the context of Khayal cannot be separated from the larger history of the Indian subcontinent. This essay traces the evolution of Khayal as it intertwines with the history of India as a nation. Now, if popular narratives trace Khayal's origin to Vedic chants and folk music of antiquity, historians locate the development of Khayal within the royal courts of Mughal emperors in medieval North India. Renowned as hotbeds for a wide range of Indo-Persian cultural forms, the courts offered patronage to diverse musicians and music genres. Interactions among these over the course of several centuries led to the genre's crystallization. Prominent among those that influenced these crystallization through musical contributions and synthesis, as well as patronage, were musician poet Amir Khusro. He existed during the 13th century AD, and Sharqi sultans of Jaunpur in the 15th century, and several Muslim and Indo-Persian musicians or qawwals, including Niyamat Khan Sadarang. He lived in the 17th century AD. While scholars differ in their accounts of its early development, there is consensus that by the 17th century, Khayal was established as a form of court entertainment that drew upon both the religious qawwali and the secular qawwalis. The first written reference to Khayal is found in a text from this period. The form continued to evolve over the 18th century, with musicians incorporating features of the Dhrupad style within it. It is in this period that Khayal performance assumed a structure that bears resemblance to its presentation style today. During this period, terminology in Khayal was rooted in concepts that had a long history and a public presence. These concepts, such as Swara, Raga, and Tala, had been part of several influential Sanskrit and Persian musicological texts written since the 8th century. The concepts were and are still common to music genres across North and South India. For example, Drupad and Carnatic music. In the Mughal courts, Rag had been the subject of poetry and of commissioned artworks, such as the Ragmala series of miniature paintings. At the same time, the theoretical articulation of these concepts had only a nominal relationship to their interpretations in Khayal practice of the 18th century. The genre had been primarily a practitioner's craft for at least the previous century, taught within hereditary Muslim musician communities and performed by master musicians, ustads from such families. The overarching political shift in India over the 8th and 19th centuries, the gradual consolidation of the British rule, had deep implications for Khayal. Firstly, hereditary musician communities began to be restructured as the power dynamics shifted between the colonial government and various Indian rulers who were the key patrons for Khayal. Key patrons for Khayal as well as other genres. Patronage to arts declined in several erstwhile royal courts, and a few emerged as cultural centers, offering benefaction to musicians from across North India. Many master musicians traveled to these centers, striving to define their uniqueness in this new context. A musical outcome of these changes was the rise in the mid-19th century of Khayal Gharanas, distinctive styles of Khayal performance. Gharanas, which were literally family lineages, were a socio-musical feature that arose as Muslim hereditary professionals, which is in vocal as well as in instrumental gharanas, which responded to dwindling patronage and a competitive market. Historically, music was one of several crafts that was taught by master practitioners and acquired through long-term apprenticeship. This pedagogic mode, referred to as the Ustad-Shagird relationship in an Islamic context, in Hindu context it is Guru Shishya Parampara, in Muslim context it is Ustad-Shagird relationship, or the Guru Shishya Parampara in a Hindu context, ensured the transmission of specialized performance knowledge from the master to apprentice or disciple, including that of distinctive stylistic approaches, techniques, and repertoires. As courtly patronage declined, Muslim musician families ensured their uniqueness for patrons by restricting this specialized knowledge within close-knit communities through the training of disciples and arranging of marriages within familial networks. Over a few generations, pedagogic practices, musical ideologies, and compositional repertoires of particular musician families solidified into recognizable styles that were referred to as gharanas. These assumed acute significance as Khayal gradually transformed into a concert genre, and practitioners traveled from one court to another and further to urban cultural centers. Even as the stylistic templates of Gharana strengthened by the late 19th century, Gharana musicians had began to teach students from outside the family, either from aristocratic or from professional musician families. In Maharashtra, many of these non-hereditary students were closely involved in Sangeet Natak or dance drama productions that were popular at the time. In the 19th to early 20th centuries, the notion of music gharanas came to represent the aesthetic approaches of iconic master musicians. In Khayal, gharanas are named after places, either the regions to which the originary musicians belonged or the courts where they flourished. For example, the contemporary form of Agra Gharana is understood to draw its stylistic features from the performance style of 19th century vocalist Ghagge Khudabakhsh, who was from a musician family from Agra. Other prominent Khayal Gharanas today are Gwalior, Kirana, Patiala, and Jaipur Atrauli. Alongside these shifts in the culture and practice of Khayal, the genre was also garnering the interest of researchers and cultural activists in India. Since the late 1700s, Indologist researchers studying the region's cultural past had begun to write about Indian music, primarily its court and temple traditions. The first scholarly work on Indian music by the influential British scholar Sir William Jones relied largely on Sanskrit music theory texts and examined the concept of rag. Over the next century, several works by British writers followed. Together, these works presented the traditions as subjects worthy of study and an Indian counterpart to European classical music. The attention from British scholars to these music genres was central to shaping cultural activism by Indian nationalists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Growing Indian nationalist sentiments in the political context of British colonial rule were influenced also by Indologist and modernist ideas. Activism in this period was inspired by an imagination of India as a modern nation state with an ancient Hindu Brahminical past. Classical performance arts were pivotal to this project. Khayal, in particular, was growing in popularity, and musicians and patrons believed that it had the potential to be shaped into a classical performance art befitting the nascent nation. Historically, royalty, aristocracy, and the wealthy had patronized it. Now, British writers had endorsed it. The music itself was canonical, structured around complex theoretical principles, and linked to ancient texts. Several urban Hindu Brahmins assumed the role of cultural activists to frame Khayal as a national music. Influencing their work was religious politics that was concerned with claiming the custodianship of Khayal for educated Hindus away from Muslim practitioners, thus elevating its social location and the reinforcement of the music's theoretical basis and historical origins. Khayal activism in early 20th century was ambitious in its scale and succeeded in fundamentally transforming the social character of the music. Developments in Khayal retroactively identified as a period of its reform. They were fragmented and initiated by individuals with varied goals. The activities were concentrated in urban centers and provincial capitals such as Mumbai, Pune, Calcutta, Lucknow, and Baroda. They were personified most prominently in historical figures such as musicologists. Saurindra Mohan Tagore, who lived from 1840 to 1914, and Vishnu Narayan Bhatkhande, who lived from 1860 to 1936, and vocalist Vishnu Digambar Paluskar, who lived from 1872 to 1931. So these three musicologists were pivotal in establishing Khayal music and documenting it. Reformist work was carried out in different parts of North India. Music schools and institutions were established as alternatives to the traditional master-disciple frameworks. Now, textual theoretical works and compilations were published, resulting in the reorganization of musical knowledge. Several new compositions were created to substitute the previously erotic emphasis in the lyrics with that of devotion. Erotic means shringar and devotion means bhakti. With theoretical and spiritual associations, the music could be legitimized as a cultural form appropriate to be patronized and performed by members of socially respectable classes. Newer patronage structures and modes of performance, which were public concerts and music festivals, music circles, recording contracts, institutional teaching, and radio broadcast, emerged. Patron and performer demographics shifted to include the urban middle and upper classes. The institutionalization of Khayal pedagogy proved to be a catalyst for the shift in practitioner demographic as well as a locus of tension between Muslim ustads and Hindu cultural activists. Hereditary musicians, according to the activists, were illiterate, secretive, and followed non-standardized, almost arbitrary pedagogic practices. Such methods, they said, had led to disparities in musicological principles assumed by Khayal singers and the unavailability of its training for students outside hereditary communities. Activists made efforts towards establishing music schools as alternatives to individualized methods, such as Paluskar's Akhil Bharatiya Gandharva Sangeet Mahavidyalaya was established in Lahore in 1901, and Bhatkhande's music colleges in Baroda, Lucknow, and Gwalior. A significant implication of relocating music pedagogy to these modern institutions was the opening up of Khayal training for non-hereditary students from diverse backgrounds, also including girls and women from bourgeois families. The restructured Khayal pedagogy in these institutions incorporated practices such as standardized curriculum, notations, theoretical texts, and specialized programs to train music practitioners and teachers. In the early 20th century, a generation of literate Hindus trained as scholar musicians in these newly established institutions entered as a new category of music professionals alongside the Muslim ustads. Even as music institutions grew in their reach, Khayal ustads innovatively utilized the increased focus on the genre. Charismatic and authoritative musicians such as Abdul Karim Khan, who lived from 1872 to 1937, Fayaz Khan, 1880 to 1950, and Aladia Khan, who lived from 1855 to 1946, gained urban audiences through concerts and newly available sound recording technologies. Several Gharana musicians, especially in Maharashtra, apprenticed Hindu non-hereditary musicians, both male and females, alongside disciples within families. Over the decades, many of these non-hereditary students, such as Savai Gandharva, who lived from 1886 and till 1952, Kesarbai Kerkar, 1892 to 1977, Mogubai Kurdikar, 1904 to 2001, came to be acclaimed as Gharana representatives. Over the next century, knowledge transmitted through Gharana pedagogy among both hereditary and non-hereditary musicians and has come to be recognized as the authentic form of knowledge in Khayal. Almost absent from this narrative are hereditary female music specialists who performed genres that shared stylistic features as well as repertoire with Khayal. Many of these were wives, courtesans specializing in music, dance, poetry, and theatre. The social context for performances by male and female musicians had overlapped considerably before the reform. The wives interacted professionally with khayal ustads and other musicians, exchanging musical knowledge and also their repertoire of genres such as thumri, dadra, kajri, etc. These repertoire was adopted by several khayal ustads as part of their concerts. However, given the courtesans' perceived associations with hedonistic lifestyles and promiscuity, they were regarded unacceptable as part of Khayal's story and were actually written out of it. The introduction at the beginning of the 20th century of recording and broadcast technologies influenced Khayal performance as well as its consumption by audiences. Khayal musicians were among the first Indian musicians to be recorded. Recording formats, chiefly wax cylinders and phonograph discs, placed limitations on the length of the recordings and as a corollary on the very form of the music. Musicians quickly learned to adapt, even innovate their recorded performances to the demands of technology. While the practice of listening to recordings grew popular in the first 2 decades, it was not until the expansion of the radio broadcast industry in the 1930s that recorded music entered the urban middle-class household. For listeners, mass-mediated dissemination of khayal afforded an experience of recorded music that was comparable to extended live performances, shaping both listening practices and audience expectations. By 1947, the social dimensions of khayal music included traditional and institutional pedagogies, hereditary and non-hereditary musicianship, and live and recorded performance modes. As part of the post-independence project of nation building, the cultural domain was developed by the establishment of bodies such as Sangeet Natak Academy, which was inaugurated in 1953. The state-owned All India Radio and later the national television broadcaster Doordarshan. Such agencies have continued to support khayal music prominently, making it accessible to the public of the nation through concerts, recordings, music education, grants and fellowships, etc. The second half of the 20th century was also a period when khayal entered the global stage on several levels. On one hand, beginning in the 1960s, instrumental artists such as Ravi Shankar and Ali Akbar Khan introduced Hindustani classical music genres to mainstream audiences in Europe and North America through concerts, collaborations with popular musicians, and training of non-Indian disciples. On the other hand, the growing Indian diaspora implied transnational audiences, patrons, and students for the classical form. By the end of the 20th century, the possibilities of short and long-term assignments outside India had opened even for lesser-known khayal musicians. Simultaneously, technological shifts transformed Khayal further during the post-independence period. The availability of cassettes since the 1970s and later of numerous digital formats or platforms presented musicians with opportunities to reach their audiences through small scale productions and to create longer recordings that were less restricted by the limitations of the medium. Listeners could utilize the ease of these new mediums by duplicating existing recordings and recording live concerts. In the last few decades, internet technologies have facilitated not only the circulation of Khayal recordings, but also allowed musicians to interact and train students online. Khayal's status as a national classical tradition has only strengthened more than a century after the reform began. Established as a concert genre, an academic discipline, and a mainstream vocation, Khayal provides livelihood to music professionals of both genders, performers, teachers, and scholars. The presence of Khayal musicians, pedagogic institutions, and cultural organizations has grown in most parts of the nation. Local music circles and appreciation societies of the early 20th century have evolved into cultural organizations such as the Pan Indian Picnic. In the national arena, institutional support for Khayal has widened beyond state patronage to include several multinational and national corporate firms as well as non-government organizations. Gharanas continue to enjoy a certain legitimacy. However, the orthodoxy has reduced considerably. Musicians have the freedom to experiment with different Gharana styles and craft their individual approaches. Khayal vocalists trained through mentor-disciple lineages have achieved success as performers. Simultaneously, music schools and colleges that teach Khayal have proliferated throughout northern India and beyond, training students and amateurs of varied competence. Today, Khayal is one of the foremost classical music performance forms in the nation. Dhrupad, the other vocal genre included in North Indian classical music, has a smaller and niche audience, both nationally and internationally. Qawwali, historically an influence on Khayal, maintains a primarily religious connotation. At the same time, these genres are only a small segment in the wider soundscape of India that is dominated largely by commercial film and popular music. So this is all about Khayal, how it evolved, and the current status of Khayal um, in India and many other countries. In the next class, we'll listen to one or two recordings of Khayal and then understand what semi-classical music is all about.